Just a forward little preamble to retest data and subsequent week of training. Welcome to my COVID garage gym. So over the past roughly 25, 30 years now, I have had the pleasure of working with some of the best athletes and some of the best coaches, trainers, and medical personnel in throughout the world in pretty much every sport imaginable. Obviously your mainstream sports, but even track and field and skeleton and all kinds of interesting stuff. But over that that time frame, there's a couple things that I've learned through both data as well as just empirical knowledge and trial and error and being involved. So in both analytics, assessing functional performance, and then working to create movement-based functional training programs, the first thing is you really have to look at what I would refer to as primary drivers. You have to look at fundamental patterns. There's not a lot of them. Those are the patterns that drive the aesthetic, that drive the mechanic, that drive the stuff that you see. I will warn everyone that right now there's an influx of technology into sports, and that's a great thing. Sports science, sport technology. The downside is that there's so many new products, and everybody's measuring something different, and it's kind of like a whole war to see who can measure the fanciest stuff, right? And certainly the aesthetic and the outcome is a way to measure outcome, performance, right? But it doesn't give you a lot of insight as to how that's being produced. So if you spend a lot of time chasing aesthetic with fancy equipment, you're not going to have a lot of success treating the athlete in terms of creating functional performance gains and rehabbing back to, back from injury to game practice ready status, right? So the first thing is when you look at the data, you have to understand what drives the bulk of everything that you can measure out here, right? And don't get carried away and enamored by all the special cool things you can measure until you know what's driving them, okay? And this is specifically in assessing functional performance and creating functional-based programs. The second thing is when you create a program, that program has to address those micro-functional patterns, right? Those base patterns. If you're trying to, look, I've worked with some of the best athletes in the world in, like I said, pretty much every sport you can imagine. Even the most gifted athlete, when you tell them to do something different in their full activity, tennis serve, baseball swing, golf swing, whatever it might be, it's virtually impossible, even for the world's greatest athletes, to change based on a verbal cue in a very complex pattern. And for that pattern, if they manage to actually change at all, is virtually impossible for them to then embed that change as a real-time, ongoing part of what they do, okay? So you have to understand a little bit about basic motor programming, right? Just basic programming, and you have to be able to use your assessment of fundamental drivers to affect micro-patterning. And those patterns have to be critical to the aesthetic and to the mechanic. If they are superficial, you're just chasing your tail. So the two primary things to understand about using data to drive programming is you have to boil down to the primary drivers. I've written a lot of papers and I've done a bunch of educational workshops and webinars and talks on fundamental drivers, on these primary drivers. You have to understand them. You have to understand how you can affect them, and then you have to be able to put together programming that will allow an athlete to adopt new sequencing and new patterning at a micro level before it can be on a macro level, on a big level, on a complex level. Understand it at the full level of whatever the sport is, virtually impossible to affect micro-based driver change, okay? So the two things, again, just to hit home, understand the fundamental drivers, right? Don't get enamored by technology and all the fancy things you can measure. Understand the primary drivers and measure those primary drivers. When you use subsequent data collections, especially early on in a program, there's no need to retest the full swing or the full throw or the full serve or whatever it is. That is not going to be affected immediately. What you want to do is test the micro patterns. Are we eliciting the changes and the micro patterns that we hope to see. And if we don't, how do we then adjust our cueing and our programming to actually elicit the changes we want to start to see? Understanding that early on, a lot of those changes are overly cued because they have to be. Eventually, we want them to be internally cued and athlete cued and eventually autopilot. But you have to be able to use data then not on the, so you don't test someone swinging a baseball bat and work with them for a few weeks and then test them swinging a baseball bat. It's going to be virtually impossible to see if you're having a real impact on your micro patterns. So remember, measure your primary movers, your fundamental drivers, okay? Create programming around changing those patterns using motor skill development and functional training concepts, and then retest on micro patterns until they're at a point down the road, maybe 8, 12 weeks plus, where testing the full pattern makes sense, okay? So this is just a little forward about how to use data and to drive these functional programs, both from an analytics perspective and a functional improvement or functional movement perspective.